The afternoon sun cast a glow on a bustling bank in downtown Los Angeles. Endless lines formed, and the air buzzed with hushed complaints from customers waiting their turn. Each of the four tellers was swamped, while a few well-dressed managers strolled by, exuding an air of rushed importance. Near the entrance, Harriet Vaughn, an elderly woman, quietly walked in. Clutching a worn envelope with slightly trembling fingers, she surveyed the busy room with anxious eyes. Harriet had ventured here for one reason: a glaring mistake on her account that threatened her limited finances. For someone on a tight budget, every penny counted. She hoped a quick explanation would fix the issue, but deep in her heart, Harriet couldn't shake a sense of unease. In large institutions like this, the humbler a person looked, the more likely they'd be overlooked, or worse. As Harriet scanned the room, a young teller named Emily Townsend caught her eye briefly, but then looked away, focusing on another customer. Harriet moved gingerly to line up. She was used to long waits, but the tension and impatience around her heightened her nerves. Each passing minute felt heavier, and with each shuffle forward, Harriet's grip on the envelope tightened. She thought, surely they'll see it's a small mistake. They'll help me fix it. At the bank's far end, the manager, Mark Whitaker, was pacing between desks. He wore a crisp suit and a faint, impatient smile that wavered whenever someone asked him a question. Mark had built a reputation for catering to the wealthiest clients first. If you didn't have a robust account balance, you were a lesser priority in his eyes. As Harriet inched forward, Mark's gaze flicked over her once, then swiftly moved on. At last, it was Harriet's turn at the counter. She offered Emily a tentative smile. "Good afternoon," Harriet said, voice wavering. "I have a concern about these new charges on my account. They appeared last month, and I don't." Emily, who looked more exhausted than malicious, cut her off with a brief sigh. "Ma'am, please place your ID on the counter." Harriet complied, sliding over both ID and envelope. Emily tapped on her keyboard, scanning Harriet's account. After a moment, her expression sharpened. "These fees are standard maintenance charges," she declared. "It's all in your agreement." Harriet blinked, confusion etched on her lined face. "I don't recall seeing anything about that. It's a large sum, and it came out of nowhere." She paused, voice quivering. "This can't be right. I can hardly afford my medication this month." Emily exhaled audibly, as though confronted with a common complaint. "Well, if you keep a low balance, these fees kick in," she explained, pushing the papers back. "It's your responsibility to read the fine print. The bank isn't doing anything unusual." The remark, laced with a subtle scorn, jolted Harriet. She'd expected sympathy, or at least civility. Instead, it felt like she was being scolded for her limited means. Harriet tried to maintain composure. I've never seen these deductions before, and it's not in the statements I got last year. Please, can you check thoroughly?" A flicker of annoyance crossed Emily's face. "I've checked," she replied curtly. "Everything looks correct from our side. If you can't handle the fees, maybe you should upgrade your account or keep a higher balance." She punctuated her words with a tight-lipped smile that felt anything but friendly. The overheard conversations in the bank hushed slightly as some onlookers sensed the tension. Harriet's cheeks warmed with embarrassment. She mustered her courage. "Could you please ask a manager? I'm certain this is an error." She gestured to the envelope, which contained meticulously kept records, each penny accounted for. Emily parted her lips to respond, but footsteps interrupted. Manager Mark Whitaker stepped in, clearly having caught part of the exchange. Towering over Harriet, he gave the older woman a dismissive look. "Is there an issue here?" he asked, though the question sounded more like an accusation. Harriet swallowed. "Yes, sir. I'm hoping to correct these charges. They shouldn't be there. Could you look into it?" Mark glanced at the papers Harriet offered. With a sweeping motion, he half-read them before returning them. "Ms. Vaughn, these fees are standard. If you can't maintain our minimum daily balance, you incur them automatically. That's policy." His voice was calm but devoid of sympathy, as though Harriet was yet another trivial complaint in his day. Harriet's shoulders sagged. "I simply don't have more money to keep in the account," she whispered, frustration mixing with desperation. I'm not ignoring your policy, but I can't function if I lose this money every month. Mark's forced politeness slid away, replaced by blunt impatience. Ma'am, if you can't meet the bank's requirements, you might want to bank elsewhere. Now, you're holding up the line for customers with real business. The hush around them deepened. Harriet's face drained of color. A wave of humiliation coursed through her. She cast a pleading glance around, searching for a kind face, but found only averted gazes and polite disinterest. At that moment, from a quiet spot in the waiting area, a figure wearing a plain cap and jacket had been observing. He'd come to the bank for routine errands, but when he caught sight of the manager's dismissive stance and Harriet's trembling posture, he decided not to remain passive. Taking a measured breath, he rose from the chair, approached the scene, and in a calm, firm tone, addressed Mark. Is this really how you handle someone's concerns? The entire section of the bank froze, pivoting eyes to see who'd spoken. Gradually, the man doffed his cap, revealing his instantly recognizable features. A spark of recognition rippled among bystanders as they realized it was Keanu Reeves standing up for an elderly stranger. Harriet stared in disbelief, unsure if her humiliation had taken a surreal turn or if a miracle had materialized. Either way, the dynamic was about to shift. A startled hush fell over the bank lobby as Keanu Reeves confronted Mark Whitaker. The manager's expression shifted from impatience to a flustered defensiveness. The ordinary hum of chatter and tapping keyboards dissipated, replaced by a silent crowd that recognized a moment of significance was unfolding. Mark cleared his throat, determined to maintain control. "Mr. Reeves," he began, voice attempting cordiality, "I didn't realize you were here. This is a private matter, though. So perhaps—" Keanu cut him off with calm authority. "This lady is asking for help, not condescension. And from what I heard, it sounds like you're dismissing her without even verifying her claims." His gaze flicked to Harriet. "Is that right?" Harriet swallowed, her voice wavering. "That's correct. I only found these charges last week. They're draining my small pension. I just need them removed or explained." Mark forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I can't divulge account details to just anyone, Mr. Reeves. Bank policy, you understand." He tried to reassert power by referencing official procedures, but Keanu remained unfazed. "Of course, but from what I see, you haven't addressed her concerns at all. Maybe your policy includes compassion for a client who's obviously in distress." It was a rhetorical question, and Mark knew it. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. Emily Townsend, the teller who'd spoken to Harriet initially, hovered behind the manager, attempting to fade into the background. But the attention was now too squarely on Mark and Harriet. The older woman clutched her envelope, standing with quiet desperation, yet emboldened by Keanu's unexpected support. Mark inhaled, posture stiffening. "We do treat our clients with respect," he insisted. "However, we have guidelines about minimum balances and monthly fees. Ms. Vaughn is experiencing standard deductions. There's no error here." Harriet felt tears prick at her eyes. "Sir, I've read every statement. These fees never appeared before. Something changed, and no one warned me." She paused, voice trembling. "I'm not refusing to pay anything legitimate, but I can't do this if it's indefinite." Keanu turned to Harriet, gentling his tone. "Could you show us the statements? Let's see what's actually going on." She nodded, offering her envelope. He flipped through the papers, scanning columns of transactions. From the hush behind them, onlookers in line craned their necks, wanting to witness the confrontation's outcome. Meanwhile, Mark's composure cracked a bit. "This doesn't need to become a spectacle," he muttered. "Ms. Vaughn, I suggest you schedule an appointment for a thorough review. We're quite busy now." He gestured toward the line of waiting customers. Keanu looked up, eyebrows raised. "It's been a spectacle since you started humiliating her in front of everyone," he countered. "And from what I see, these new charges began just 3 months ago without prior notice." "Harriet, correct me if I'm wrong." Harriet's voice steadied. "Yes, exactly. 3 months ago. Lumps of $40 or more." I nearly missed paying my utility bill because of it. The mention of a specific amount forced Mark to realize evasion wouldn't work. He let out an exasperated sigh. Then let me step into my office with Ms. Vaughn, and we can discuss. Again, Keanu interrupted. No, we'll handle it right here, if Harriet is okay with that. The problem started publicly. It can be fixed publicly too, so she doesn't get cornered in an office alone. Harriet looked at him with gratitude, appreciating that he was protective, ensuring accountability. Stung by the challenge, Mark nodded, albeit reluctantly. Fine, he said curtly. Emily, pull up Ms. Vaughn's account. Let's see if there's anything unusual. Emily moved quickly to a nearby computer station, inputting Harriet's account details. For a tense minute or so, the bank returned to a hush. Harriet's heart hammered in her chest. She half expected the staff to find an excuse, some arcane rule to justify the charges. Meanwhile, Keanu stood at her side, scanning the surroundings. Observers who recognized him didn't approach with usual starstruck fervor. They watched with quiet respect. Emily eventually frowned at the screen. She shot Mark a nervous look. Sir, it shows here that these fees are premium-level charges typically assigned to high-tier accounts. Ms. Vaughn's account is basic. She never requested premium features. This looks incorrect. A ripple of discontented surprise rustled the listening crowd. Harriet's face clouded with disbelief, though she'd insisted all along it was a bank error. Premium-level charges? That's absolutely not mine. Her voice grew steadier. I never signed anything like that. Keanu tapped the statement Harriet had brought, referencing the same line. So it's an internal glitch or a misapplied code. Either way, you wrongly withdrew money from Harriet's account for months. He let the accusation hang. You have an explanation, Mr. Whitaker? Mark's jaw tightened. It must be a system glitch, he said haltingly. We can correct it. The bank will reverse the fees, Ms. Vaughn, once we finalize some forms. That's it. He tried to appear magnanimous, but his sweaty brow betrayed nerves. Keanu's gaze narrowed. You call it a glitch, but Harriet endured weeks of anxiety, near panic over bills. For someone on a fixed income, that's a big deal. He paused, letting the gravity sink in. Is an apology too much to expect? Mark gave a short, forced nod, turning to Harriet. Ma'am, I apologize for the inconvenience. We'll rectify your account. His tone wasn't exactly warm, but at least he uttered the words. Harriet, still stunned by the abrupt shift, nodded in acceptance. She quietly uttered, Thank you. Emily typed rapidly, reversing the charges. It'll take a day or so to process, Ms. Vaughn, she explained. But the funds will be returned. No more incorrect fees. I promise. Relief swept Harriet's features, but also an undercurrent of exhaustion. She murmured a quiet thanks. The hush in the bank began easing, as if a collective breath was released. Some customers offered Harriet empathetic smiles. Others gave Keanu grateful nods. In those fleeting expressions, the bank's usual atmosphere of impatience softened momentarily into something more humane. But Keanu Reeves wasn't entirely satisfied. The manager's abrupt apology felt superficial. Harriet had nearly been dismissed as a nuisance until he intervened. A small group near the front had overheard everything and were softly applauding Harriet for standing her ground. The sense that something bigger had transpired settled over everyone. Turning to Harriet, Keanu gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Are you okay? We should ensure they correct everything, including any overdraft or penalty you might have incurred because of this. She gazed at him, blinking back the emotional overload. Yes, please. If possible, I want to make sure my account is safe. This is all the money I have. Hearing that, Mark swallowed hard. Realizing how precarious the situation was for Harriet, he forced a calmer tone. We'll verify all details, Ms. Vaughn. I'll personally see to it that your account is fully rectified. Harriet inhaled slowly. Thank you, she said. Then, turning to Keanu, eyes glistening with gratitude, she whispered, I can't begin to say how much it means that you stepped in. I wasn't sure what else to do. Keanu gave a gentle smile in return. You deserve respect, Harriet. I'm just glad I got here in time. The hush gradually returned to the bank, but it was a different hush now, one of respect, reflection, and perhaps a little awe for the quiet transformation that had just taken place. As the immediate crisis resolved, Harriet Vaughn found herself guided by a more cooperative teller to finalize the reversal of fees on her account. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves stepped aside to allow Harriet privacy while she signed documents and checked the updated balances. The tension within the bank subsided, replaced by a mix of curiosity and subdued admiration directed toward the unassuming actor. Mark Whitaker, the manager, hovered near the edges, clearly uncomfortable with the fiasco that had unfolded publicly. He tried to salvage the bank's image with a curt apology, but the shift in atmosphere had its own momentum. A handful of customers approached Harriet, offering nods of encouragement or softly spoken words like, "Good for you," or "I'm sorry this happened." Harriet greeted each gesture with a gentle nod, still processing how quickly everything had changed. Keanu stood by a row of chairs, leaning casually against a tall partition. A bank security guard who had been on the verge of confronting Harriet earlier approached, offering a brief, awkward salute. "Mr. Reeves," the guard said. "If only we realized earlier," his sentence trailed off, as though acknowledging their complicity in ignoring Harriet's pleas. Keanu gave a polite half-smile in response. "It's never too late to do better," he replied softly. Meanwhile, Harriet and the teller completed the final steps. Emily Townsend, the teller who'd initially brushed Harriet aside, lingered just behind them, her face etched with regret. She took a breath and gently tapped Harriet's shoulder. "Ma'am, I'm truly sorry for how I spoke to you," she said, voice wavering. "I was under a lot of pressure, but that's no excuse." Harriet regarded her with searching eyes, then offered a slow, understanding nod. "We all have moments we regret," she replied, not unkindly. "Let's move on." While Harriet's account was now restored, a sense that the bank's management might be covering deeper flaws remained. Harriet, finishing her paperwork, gently asked, "Did you say other older customers face similar fees?" Emily cast a quick look at Mark, who stood within earshot. She swallowed. "I'm not sure. I only see what's on my screen, and it's not all accounts. But, Ms. Vaughn, you're not the only one who's mentioned it." Keanu, who'd come closer, caught that hint. "If that's the case, you might need a more thorough audit," he suggested, voice mild but firm. Mark frowned, stepping forward. "We'll handle any anomalies internally," the manager insisted, controlling his frustration with measured calm. "This isn't an ongoing issue, just an unfortunate glitch." Harriet's brow furrowed. "A glitch that singled out seniors?" she asked quietly. Mark opened his mouth, but no response emerged. Keanu studied the manager's expression, a flicker of suspicion forming in his own eyes. "If it's just a glitch, you'll be transparent, right? Let people see the numbers, correct them publicly?" he prompted. A murmur of agreement from nearby onlookers followed, building pressure on Mark. "Yes, of course," Mark said tightly. "We'll do whatever's necessary." Harriet, though relieved her personal crisis was addressed, still sensed an underlying tension. She turned to Keanu, voice hushed. "I'm grateful you were here. Without you, I fear they'd have brushed me off completely." Keanu shook his head gently. "Even if I hadn't stepped in, you deserve this outcome. But I'm glad I could help shine a spotlight." Harriet pressed her lips together, nodding, letting the moment settle. Around them, the normal bank rhythm resumed slowly. Clients returned to the counters for routine deposits and questions. The hush gave way to subdued conversations, but no one forgot the earlier confrontation. A short queue parted as Harriet walked away from the teller. Envelope clutched once more, but now her expression bore relieved tears. An older man in line whispered, "Congrats, ma'am," offering an encouraging pat on her arm. Keanu accompanied Harriet toward the exit, weaving past a few final watchers. A fleeting hush followed them, eventually broken by Harriet's soft voice. "Can I treat you to a coffee somewhere?" she asked. "It's the least I can offer for your kindness." The sincerity in her question drew out a warm chuckle from him. "I'd be honored, Harriet," he replied, "but let me pay for that coffee. Or better yet, Let me invite you to a place of your choosing. Harriet hesitated, not wanting to impose. You're too kind, she started, but he shook his head. Nonsense. Let's celebrate your victory, small though it may feel. They stepped through the bank's glass doors into the bright afternoon light. A moment of hush enveloped them, one that felt entirely different from the tense hush inside. Harriet glanced back at the building, exhaling. Do you think they'll truly fix things for others, too? She asked, quiet worry slipping in. Keanu's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. I suspect they'll face scrutiny, but if they're wise, they'll correct everything. If not, the public will respond to any wrongdoing. We can ensure that, if needed. Harriet nodded. I never wanted a fight, just fairness. She paused, swallowing the lingering lump of emotion in her throat. Sometimes that's harder to find than I ever expected. Those words. A wave of empathy washed through Keanu. Unfortunately, yes, he answered. But every now and then, we find the right moment to set it straight. In a swirl of city noise, car horns, footsteps, distant chatter, the two walked along the sidewalk. Harriet's spirit felt lighter than it had in days, the crushing sense of financial doom lifting at least for the moment. Keanu guided her gently across a crosswalk, unaffected by passers-by who recognized him and shot curious glances. They were engaged in their own quiet conversation, forging a bond over a situation that initially threatened to degrade Harriet's dignity but ended up reaffirming her worth. They settled on a modest cafe a few blocks away, a snug place where Harriet could breathe freely. Inside, as they sipped coffee in worn-out chairs, Harriet learned more about Keanu's perspective on everyday empathy, while he listened patiently to her stories from decades past. Her family, her lost husband, her struggle to stay afloat on a fixed income. They had come from drastically different worlds. Yet in that moment, they felt united by shared compassion. By the time they parted ways, Harriet clutched more than just an envelope of corrected statements. She carried renewed faith that not everyone would treat her like a nuisance. As for Keanu, he just had an ordinary errand turn into an extraordinary chance to highlight injustice. And though the day ended peacefully, an undercurrent of vigilance remained. Harriet's story was just one among many, and there was no guarantee the bank manager would truly overhaul the system. But for Harriet, at least, the fight ended in triumph and a victory for decency at large. Word of the incident traveled fast. A few bank customers who witnessed the dramatic standoff secretly snapped photos or short videos on their phones. That same evening, social media platforms crackled with mentions of Keanu Reeves stepping in to defend an elderly woman at a local bank. Some users found it too good to be true. Others verified it with accounts from onlookers and staff. Soon, dozens of posts praising Harriet's courage and Keanu's moral stand circulated widely. The bank, confronted with a looming PR crisis, scrambled to respond. Managers higher up the chain demanded an internal review of Harriet Vaughn's case and any other potential anomalies. By the next morning, Mark Whitaker found himself in tense meetings with corporate executives. Reluctantly, he admitted that Harriet's fees were incorrectly applied, though he tried to spin the fiasco as a minor glitch amplified by the star's presence. Despite the management's attempts, the story kept growing. The more Mark tried to downplay Harriet's experience, the more outraged the public became. Harriet, meanwhile, found her phone pinging with messages from friends who recognized her in viral clips and from strangers offering words of support. Overwhelmed by all the attention, she tried to keep a low profile. She valued her privacy and felt uneasy about being thrust into the media swirl. Still, she recognized that her ordeal might help others who faced similar injustices. Keanu also received a wave of messages, some from fellow celebrities or fans praising him, others from activists wanting him to champion broader banking reforms. True to his usual modesty, he responded only in general terms, emphasizing Harriet's bravery rather than patting himself on the back. She deserves the spotlight, he said in one short interview. I just happened to be there at the right time. Meanwhile, Harriet discovered that multiple local news outlets wanted interviews. At first, she considered declining, reluctant to let the incident overshadow her daily life. But conversations with supportive neighbors, and a quick phone call from Keanu himself changed her mind. If your voice encourages banks to treat seniors fairly, he told her gently, maybe it's worth the trouble. Sensing the possibility of making a difference, Harriet agreed to share her story on a local news segment. The interview took place in her modest living room. A single camera crew, a polite journalist, and Harriet in her best sweater, looking equal parts anxious and resolute. She recounted the humiliating day, how she had no intention of causing a scene but was forced to stand her ground. All I wanted, she said softly into the camera, was an explanation. No one should be made to feel invisible just because they have limited means. She praised Keanu for standing with her. He saw I was being dismissed and refused to let it happen, she added. The broadcast aired that evening, generating a fresh wave of support. Hashtags about senior dignity trended locally, joined by calls to examine the bank's fee structures. Harriet's face, once overshadowed in a crowd, became a symbol of how easily everyday people can be exploited. Some viewers reached out, confiding that they too had discovered strange fees on their accounts after seeing Harriet's story. Slowly, a pattern emerged, hinting at a systematic approach to bank profiteering from smaller account holders. Harriet confided in Keanu about the new wave of complaints. They weighed the idea of encouraging these individuals to file official disputes or even a class action lawsuit. If the bank systematically targets seniors with hidden charges, Harriet said, it needs to end, for everyone. Keanu agreed, though he also knew how complicated legal battles could become. One step at a time, he advised. But let's not let them bury this under corporate hush-ups. Amid the swirling attention, Harriet noticed her local branch had become notably more polite. On a quick visit to confirm her corrected balance, she saw Emily Townsend, the teller, greet her with genuine warmth, apologizing again for the friction. The entire atmosphere felt different, as if Harriet's stand, in the presence of a certain Hollywood star, had awakened a sense of caution among employees who might otherwise have brushed off such complaints. Mark Whitaker, on the other hand, maintained a distant stance, presumably chastened by higher-ups or simply seething with resentment at losing control. Harriet spotted him once behind a glass office partition. His smile was subdued, and his typically rigid posture appeared weighed down by the knowledge that his callous behavior had not only been exposed but also publicly condemned. Harriet pitied him to some extent. Arrogance often masks insecurity, she reasoned. Through it all, Harriet's resolve only grew firmer. Rather than remain a passive beneficiary of public sympathy, she explored ways to help others. She started volunteering at a local senior center, explaining to fellow seniors how to review their bank statements carefully. She taught them that if something seems off, they have every right to question it. Word spread that Harriet Vaughn, the bank confrontation lady, was a resource for anyone who felt powerless against corporate institutions. During a phone call, Harriet brought this up with Keanu, half joking. I never thought I'd become a resource person, she said, chuckling. Keanu's voice came warm through the line. Life's funny that way. I'm proud to see you turning adversity into empowerment. He paused, then added softly, if you ever need support for your new mission, you have it. So, from a single humiliating moment in a bank, Harriet's life took an unexpected turn. She discovered her voice, rallying others to defend their rights. Meanwhile, Keanu offered moral support from behind the scenes, refusing to let the media twist the story into some hero narrative about him alone. Because in the end, Harriet was the one who bravely walked into that bank, envelope in hand, determined not to be silenced. As the weeks passed, Harriet Vaughn found fresh purpose. Her name became quietly known among seniors grappling with unexpected fees, erroneous statements, or the labyrinth of modern banking rules. She started hosting small gatherings in the community hall. Nothing fancy, just a circle of chairs and a table for coffee. During these sessions, Harriet shared tips on reading monthly statements line by line, spotting suspicious charges, and filing formal complaints when necessary. The momentum built. Word reached a local consumer rights attorney who offered to run free workshops at Harriet's sessions. Soon, Harriet was no longer alone in her mission. A cluster of volunteers, some younger, some older, stepped in to help with reading documents or navigating bank websites. Harriet marveled at how her single humiliating day at the bank had birthed a movement of sorts. All it took was a spark, she said with a modest smile, and the right help at the right time. Meanwhile, the bank chain's head office, facing media scrutiny over Harriet's story, announced a broad audit of all elderly account holders. They expressed deep regret for any inconvenience. In an official statement, they distanced themselves from Mark Whitaker's approach, stating that individual managerial decisions do not reflect the institution's core values. Mark remained employed in a reduced role, but rumors suggested he might soon depart under the weight of negative publicity. During a quiet afternoon, Harriet returned to the same branch, accompanied by a few fellow seniors. This time, the staff welcomed them with courtesy. Emily Townsend, the teller, looked both humbled and resolute. "Ms. Vaughn, if there's anything you need, just let me know." Harriet recognized an earnest desire to do better. She gave a kind nod. "We're here to open an advocacy desk, so to speak," Harriet explained. "We'd like to see if the bank can designate an hour a week specifically for seniors, so they can review accounts free of rush or confusion." Emily blinked, impressed by Harriet's initiative. Surprisingly, Mark Whitaker emerged from his office, overhearing Harriet's idea. He approached with uncertain steps, forced smile in place. "Ms. Vaughn, I realize your concerns. We can discuss the possibility with upper management." Harriet studied him. The arrogance from before was diminished, replaced by a man who recognized the precariousness of his position. Perhaps he wasn't entirely reformed, but Harriet accepted his willingness to talk. "Thank you, Mark," she said, voice measured. "And if this works, it'll help a lot of folks who are lost in the fine print." Amid these developments, Keanu Reeves stayed informed. He and Harriet shared occasional calls or text messages, often just a few lines of encouragement. The actor humbly avoided overshadowing Harriet's leadership, though his presence had undeniably triggered the initial wave of public attention. Harriet, in her wry sense of humor, teased that their entire relationship started because of a few hidden fees. When Harriet's Bank Fairness Initiative garnered local news coverage, reporters asked if Keanu would appear at a community event celebrating progress for seniors. Harriet hesitated, not wanting to lean on star power as a crutch. She told him about the invitation. Keanu responded by praising her success. "You don't need me to overshadow your triumph," he said. "But if you want moral support, I can stand in the crowd." Harriet chuckled, replying, "Then come as you are, just like the day at the bank." On the evening of that small event, held in a simple church basement, around 50 seniors gathered, along with a few younger supporters. A modest table offered refreshments. Harriet addressed the group, thanking them for caring enough to show up. She spoke about unity, about refusing to let financial institutions bully them through sneaky charges. The audience nodded, many remembering times they'd felt powerless. Partway through, Harriet glimpsed Keanu at the back of the room, baseball cap pulled low, listening quietly. He offered her a subtle thumbs up. She felt a surge of confidence, beaming as she concluded her speech. "We can't let intimidation or the fear of looking uninformed keep us from defending what's ours. None of us should be humiliated just for asking questions." When the event ended in gentle applause, some recognized Keanu and approached him, but he deftly redirected the praise toward Harriet. "She's the one making a difference every day," he insisted. Harriet accepted a bouquet of flowers from an elderly man who exclaimed, "Bless you for leading this cause." She offered to share credit with all the volunteers assisting her. "It's never just one person," Harriet reminded them. "I got help when I needed it. Now I want to pass that on." Walking Harriet back to her car that night, Keanu reflected aloud. "It's remarkable how one dark moment in a bank can spark so much light." Harriet nodded, hugging her coat tighter against the evening chill. "I'm just grateful you stepped in so I didn't give up. That's what happens sometimes. People give up because no one sees them." Keanu frowned at the thought. "No one should feel that way, and you're making sure they don't." As Harriet drove away, her trunk full of leftover pamphlets from the night's event, she couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose deeper than she'd known in years. The memory of that humiliating day at the bank was overshadowed by the gratitude for how it ended. With a new calling, she'd become a quiet champion for fair treatment, living proof that even the smallest voices can resonate widely, especially when a certain Hollywood star takes notice. But more than that, Harriet realized she was never truly alone, and that realization gave her hope that justice, once kindled, can glow far beyond the walls of a single bank. From the moment Harriet Vaughn stepped into that bustling bank, she never intended to become a focal point for change. All she wanted was an answer, a resolution to a financial burden that threatened her stability. However, what began as an encounter laden with humiliation and dismissive indifference soon ignited a beacon of empathy and solidarity. Keanu Reeves, drawn in by the fundamental unfairness of it all, amplified Harriet's plight, exposing a system prone to exploiting the very people it should serve. In that bank, we witnessed a small revolution of conscience. The confrontation between Harriet and the bank's manager, Mark Whitaker, symbolized more than just a dispute over hidden fees. It revealed how quickly institutions can overlook the vulnerable. But Harriet refused to be silenced, and Keanu ensured the entire room, and soon the entire community, took notice. Their united stand reversed a crippling error for one older woman and sparked reforms that would aid countless others. Harriet's journey became a testament to how a single voice can resonate far beyond its initial circle. Others, once voiceless, found the courage to question their own statements and challenge unfair practices. Meanwhile, the manager's hasty dismissal of Harriet served as a cautionary reminder that no policy or bottom-line excuses treating another human being as insignificant. Ultimately, Harriet and Keanu's collaboration demonstrated that true heroism often resides in everyday acts of compassion, not solely on grand stages. Today, Harriet continues advocating for fellow seniors, offering them the tools and confidence to speak up. In doing so, she reminds us that dignity doesn't hinge on wealth or youth, but on the unshakable idea that every person matters. Sometimes, it takes a single stand, backed by empathy, championed by an unexpected ally, to ensure we never again dismiss someone in need. Through Harriet's resilience and Keanu's timely support, we're reminded that kindness and justice form the true currency of humanity.